Okay, happy to be here in Florence. Let me just make sure that I have the presentation right here. As Federica said, this is the most comprehensive review of the findings. It looks at the entire fifth wave, but it also attempts to compare the findings of the latest wave with the other waves. We've done 5 so far. The latest one is also the most comprehensive and the largest in terms of sample size. We've interviewed 25,000 people in 12 countries. The presentation today will focus on just 11. Kuwait was the 12th, and I'm not going to be referring to Kuwait. The data from Kuwait arrived a little late for me to be able to enter. The previous waves, the first wave started it took us a little bit of a time, between 6 and 9 to complete. The second wave was mostly after the eruption of the Arab Spring. There were few waves that were conducted before. And the third wave was immediately after the Arab Spring. The fourth was in 16, and the latest was the fifth in late 18, November, December 18, and between January and June 19. Because if it is a large sample, the margin of error in this survey is actually, in the fifth one, is just 2%. Okay, so this is basically the outline of my talk. I have a lot of slides. I'm not going, hopefully, to stop at each one in details. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview so that you can see what topics we are covering, what issues are of importance that we are focusing on. As you can see from the topics, we're trying to assess what are the challenges for people, how they assess economic conditions, their views of their own governance, liberties, democracy, social issues, particularly gender issues, the issue of immigration. The entire question of migration, of course, is an extremely important issue and has been for the last decade or so. So you'll see what really happened in terms of public attitudes during this period. We will focus a little bit on foreign policy, not a lot. I had to add one last slide this morning. The temptation was great to add one last slide on foreign policy. I hope some of you who are interested in foreign policy will find it useful. A lot about social media. Well, it will come at the end. So by then I will probably have spent a lot of time on other stuff. I won't be able to stop at the internet use, and trust in social media. So these basically are the issues that we will be looking at. I'll compare the fifth with the previous ones. Here are some of the major findings. The level of discontent is great. I don't think I have seen such level in any of our previous surveys. The discontent is essentially with government, but it's a much larger picture than that. There's, for example, discontent with democracy, with the concept itself as well. So we will be talking about democracy as well. The social picture is mixed. There are good news and not so good news. Perhaps one of the conclusions about the social trends is that if any of you have been thinking about the Arab Spring and what good impact it had on social attitudes, well, think again. Islamism. You'll hear me talk about religiosity more than Islamism, but there will be some discussion of Islamism as well, and the trend in this regard. We have much clearer evidence with regard to religiosity. Islamism is not an easy concept to measure, so my conclusions about Islamism are not going to be as definite as they are about religiosity. Religiosity itself is not easy to measure as well, but at least there we have a little bit more information and clearer trends from the past. Brain drain is one of my greatest conclusions with regard to immigration. You'll clearly see that the Middle East and North Africa are essentially losing their young, educated people. Their wealth essentially is migrating to Europe and the United States. That's a very, very serious problem for the region. On the regional international politics, there is no doubt that on the Israeli-Arab question, the Iran question, Iran-Turkey question, Iran-Turkey, by the way, was the last slide that I added, and on the larger picture between China and the US, I will be referring to some of those. Unfortunately for those, there isn't going to be any comparisons with the past because some of those were things that we added only recently. Asian income. I've selected Asian income to focus on. You'll see that when it comes to age, there are clearly some, well, first of all, let me also acknowledge that for the most part, there are no differences, major differences between young and old, for the most part. But the areas where there are differences are extremely significant. One of those areas you'll say is the question of immigration. That's a major issue. We will see major differences with regard to religiosity. With regard to the first one, of course, young people want to immigrate a lot more than older people. Young people are less religious. The third issue is about liberalism. Arab youth are more liberal than its older counterpart. There is much greater frustration in the street among the youth. And the youth are a lot more willing to go down the street than the older generation. The younger generation is a lot more interested in social media, using the internet, of course, but the interest in social media is much greater. And most importantly, the younger generation is a lot more willing to trust social media than older generation. With regard to income, by the way, with regard to age, think of two countries in particular. I will highlight these two countries as I speak, but if you look at the slides, you'll see that Morocco and Egypt are extremely sensitive to age. Young and old in these two countries will show up in almost every slide where I show age. With regard to income, well, the country that wins the race in terms of social polarization is actually Egypt. And here we will clearly see that the rich thinks differently than the poor. No surprise, I guess. We will see the rich much less frustrated. The level of discontent among the poor is much greater. One thing about the rich that must also be acknowledged, they are more liberal than the poor. The findings show. All right, so let's start with the challenges. These are the major challenges. As you can see, clearly economic ones are the top priority. And it is indeed the top priority for the entire region, you'll see in a minute. But corruption, service delivery, safety and stability, foreign intervention and terrorism are also major issues of concern for the entire region. Here's a look at what matters to some of these countries. On economic matters, Jordan comes on top with 70%, indicating that economic issues are their top priority. On corruption, Iraq is number one, with 33%, indicating that it is its top priority. Morocco is service delivery. For Libya, safety and stability. For Libya again and Yemen, it's foreign intervention. And for Egypt, terrorism. So obviously, I'm summarizing a lot of stuff in highlighting these elements. But if you look at the top line, you can clearly see indeed that economic issues are the single most important one for most of these countries. If you look to your left, you'll see what direction the countries are taking. This question shows that less than a quarter of the entire region believes that their countries are going in the right direction. Surprisingly, Yemen and Egypt. No one would think Yemen would think their country is moving in the right direction. It is those in the south, however, who seem to have tipped the balance in favor, not those in the north. Those in the north are much less. When I say south, this would mean the Sunnis, the Shafi'is essentially, and those in the north are mixed. And even the Sunnis in the north are not likely to define themselves as Sunnis. In our survey, the Sunnis in the north are likely to define themselves as Muslims, just Muslims. And of course, the Houthis or the Zaydis or the Shiites, you can call them whatever, their expectation about the direction is also positive, by the way. What makes the north much less positive about the direction is the fact that it's mixed. So you have a lot of Sunnis and a lot of Shiites. And the picture, therefore, now for Egypt, why is Egypt so happy with the direction? Here comes the rich. The rich in Egypt are the outliers. So they are so happy with the direction to the extent that the entire results of the country have been affected by this situation. Of course, at the bottom you can see Lebanon, and you can see Tunisia, and you can see Algeria, and you can see Palestine, and so on. But there is no doubt that Yemen, Egypt, and Morocco in particular seem to be thinking in positive, that the country is moving in a positive direction. With regard to assessment of current economic conditions, again, Egypt and Yemen and Morocco are on top, just as they were in terms of the expectations about the direction of the country. And at the bottom are the Tunisians and the Lebanese and the Algerians and the Iraqis. The overall trend shows that it is continuing to decline. Wave one, as I said, is the pre-Arab Spring. Wave two is right at the beginning of the Arab Spring, and then wave 3, 4, and 5 are the post. And as you can see, assessment of economic conditions continue to deteriorate wave after wave. How about economic future? Are people more optimistic? Slightly more than a third are. Yemen, Libya, Iraq, people are more optimistic. Lebanon, Palestine, Algeria are not. The trend overall, however, with regard to future economic conditions is to deteriorate. Things are going down. I've selected some countries to highlight. in the slide that shows the trend. And you can see most of the countries I've selected are showing signs of pessimism. Actually, all of them are showing signs of pessimism. There were some that were not showing that kind of pessimism. The ones that I've selected seems to have been all more pessimistic than others. Okay, so this is one of those slides with regard to income. And as you can see, I have 4 groups based on income. Those with high income, middle income, low income, and very low income. So the very low are the really very poor. And those in the high are essentially the top 10% of the country. So you have the top 10% of the country, and at the bottom, you essentially have the top 25% of the country. And those in between are the middle class and the lower middle class, if you want to call them this way. Now, if you look at current economic conditions, you can clearly see that the rich are much happier. Look at Egypt, 72% think that economic conditions are good compared to 19% among the poor. With regard to future economic conditions, once again, look at Egypt, 61% versus 17%. And you can see the region for all of these trends. The right direction of the country, once again, you can clearly see that Egypt is a winner, Morocco as well. This is where you can see, by the way, if I were to combine income and education, the picture would be even more stark than we see in here. Okay, we're now moving into a second topic, and that has to do with governance. Trusting government is one of those questions that we've asked in all the waves, and as you can see, only 1/3 of the MENA region Arabs are willing to trust their own governments. In Egypt, age-wise, you will see this again throughout the entire presentation. Younger people are much less willing to trust their governments. This is true in Egypt. It is also true in Morocco. In this slide, Morocco comes down there, but you'll see again the age difference is very clear when it comes to this question about trusting government. So the entire question of discontent, youth will be a lot more discontent than their parents and grandparents. And the overall trend, as you can see, there was a point early in the Arab Spring where trust increased somewhat from 47 to 53. We're now at 33%. This is for the entire region. And therefore, and the trend since the second wave, that is the early period of the Arab Spring, things have been going down the drain when it comes to trusting government. Satisfaction with the educational system. I've selected education and health to look at in addition to trusting the government. Here we are looking at education, so it's slightly more positive than the picture was when we looked at trusting government, but still less than a majority believe that the educational system in their country is good. Jordan, Palestine, and Yemen are happy. Egypt, Tunisia, Iraq, and Morocco are not happy. So even in Egypt, despite the contribution of the middle class and the rich in Egypt, things are not as good as their assessment of the economic conditions and the country's direction. With regard to this question and the next one about health, this is only the second time that we've asked, and as you can see, the trend is negative. The fourth wave in 2016 had 49% for the entire region, and the fifth wave has only 42% satisfaction with education. Similarly, with health, slightly less, in fact, with regard to health. Jordan, Yemen, and Palestine, by the way, also are on top as it was in education. And the trend here, too, is also negative. is the government creating jobs? This is a question about that shows the extent to which people have trust in government creating jobs, improving the economy. Clearly, the picture is very negative. Yemen is the only country that seems to think that the government is trying its best to do that. Perhaps enlisting people to fight the war is their idea of. The trend overall is also negative, although between the last two waves, the change is not dramatic. But there's no doubt, as you can see, it is much worse than it was just before the Arab Spring. Right on the eve of the Arab Spring, immediately after that, we can see with 25%, things are positive. And even in 12 and 13, things were still positive, dramatically dropping after 13 to 17% in 16. Freedom of expression, a little better, the satisfaction with this than with job creation. For the entire region, slightly more than 40%. Tunisia, Jordan, and Lebanon are on top. Iraq, Sudan, and Libya at the bottom. There is a big drop between the fourth and the fifth wave, from 6 to 3%, who thought freedom of expression was guaranteed, to 42%. But look earlier on the third wave with 66%. Wave 2 with 60%, as I said, is just the beginning of the Arab Spring. So for one wave, that is 12 and 13, the perception is essentially positive. We have 2/3 of the region who are positive about the future of freedom of not just future, but current freedom of expression. Corruption. There is no doubt that we can clearly see here why the overall trend is highly negative. Almost everybody in almost every country, with the exception of Morocco, Sudan, and Yemen, believe their country's state institutions are corrupt. And it doesn't really matter whether you are young or old, although younger people tend to be slightly more than concerned about corruption. It is not just that, but if you look at the other side, you can see that in terms of the future, is the country, is the state, is the government doing anything to combat corruption? And the answer for most people is no. Our country is not, with the exception of Yemen and Egypt. Every other country, the majority says no. And here again, you can see age is relevant. For the entire region, 42% think that that there is a medium to high level of combating corruption in their country, to 39 among the youth. In some cases, like Morocco, as I said earlier, Morocco and Egypt are the two countries where we can see clearly that the youth are a lot more critical. In this slide, you can see Morocco, youth 26% to 45% among the 30 years and over. Egypt, 49 to 61%. The trend in the fourth wave showed significant decline in the perception of corruption in the entire region. But the fifth one show stark differences, from 54% for the entire region to 84% in just 2 to 3 years. That's a major shift in public perception. And with regard to confidence in the government, there is a little bit of a decline, but it's really not all that important, and it's still higher than it was before the Arab Spring. So at least there's a little bit of good news. Not really a great deal of good news, but somewhat good news. Okay, so people think there is failed governance in their countries. Do they participate in protests? No, not really. We can see a difference based on age. The youth say they are indeed participating more, but even among the youth for the entire region, just a quarter of the youth. Looking at the frustration of the youth, one would have expected a lot more than this. In some places like Jordan, Tunisia, Iraq, although we've seen Iraq recently changing their mind about this, it is on the rise. Comparing the fourth wave to the fifth wave, we can see that participation in protests, this is the participation that you see to your right, is for all respondents, all ages that is. And we can see a significant rise from 13% in the fourth wave to 21% in the fifth wave. Okay. There is no doubt that income is extremely important. I've selected 3 topics related to governance: existence of corruption in public institutions, the belief that government is working to combat corruption, and those who say they trust government. And we can see clearly that the rich, the well-to-do are much more willing much more optimistic, much more trusting, and tend to think, even with regard to corruption, which is almost a consensus. We can see in Jordan, for example, that only 75% of the rich versus 91% of the poor believe that there is corruption. Egypt is similar. Fighting corruption, we can clearly see that those who are wealthy tend to have more trust in governments doing that. And those who say flatly that they do trust government, you can see rich in Egypt, 80%, poor in Egypt, only 38%. So clearly, it matters in these cases that I am mentioning, the question of income seemed to be important. A third issue I'm looking at right here is democracy. The graph to the left is about the concept of democracy and whether people think that democracy, despite its problems, is the best system there is. Clearly, for the entire region, more than 70% seem to think that this is indeed the case. Some countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, it's very high. Even Egypt is significantly high. In some countries, less so, like Yemen, for example, is just over 50%. The trend, however, is a decline compared to where we were just 2-3 years ago. There was a decline immediately after the eruption of the Arab Spring. It continued through the third wave, and then it improved some 2-3 years ago. One explanation, well, I'll leave the explanation to the slide when we come to that, but there is no doubt that with regard to the concept itself, people are at times questioning the concept. Still, a large percentage, and the overwhelming majority, seem to want to give it a try. When we ask people to assess democracy in their own country, is there a democracy? How bad, how good or bad it is, we can see that at least 2/3 believe it's bad or very bad. Libya, Sudan, and Algeria are the countries who seem to think so more than others. Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Yemen are less so. Still, in almost all the countries, with the exception of Yemen, this is the view that the democracy that they are enjoying is either bad or very bad. What is the trend since the first wave? Well, this is in fact the worst we have seen. Look at it before the Arab Spring. For the entire region, only 44% believed that democracy as practiced by their governments was good or very good. And today, was bad or very bad. And today it's 66%. So there is a significant increase in the last wave compared to the fourth wave. So the fourth wave have so far, when we looked at governance and now we're looking at democracy, you can clearly see that there has been significant erosion with regard to issues related to governance and now with regard to issues related to democracy. One of the questions that we, in trying to understand what kind of relationship people have with democracy, that we asked them about the appropriateness of democracy in their own country, whether people think that democracy is really great, but maybe it's not for us. And the answer is yes. In some countries, that is indeed the case. For the entire region, the entire region is essentially split in two halves with regard to this, with about a half thinking that it is indeed appropriate. Morocco, Yemen, Lebanon, Algeria, Jordan seem to think that. Then we go to Egypt, Palestine, Libya, Tunisia. We seem to lose the public with regard to appropriateness of democracy. If we look at the entire region, there is no doubt that there has been stability since the Arab Spring, with about 49% thinking that it is appropriate, going down to 47%. But before the Arab Spring, things were much better. We want to know why this is the case. And given the time constraints, I do have to speed things up. And I thought I was speeding things up so dramatically, I'm not stopping to explain anything. Okay, so this is one reason. Hopefully we'll do that in the discussion. This is one of the reasons. Look to the left. It is the insecurity. If I had more slides to show you, I would have also shown you the loss of economic opportunity. Those who have felt insecure after the Arab Spring and those who have felt that they've lost economically, though this is the one I'm not showing, seem to think that democracy is to blame. So it is very clear that for people in the region, democracy is a cyst in terms of what it can deliver. It is not for itself that people want democracy. It is what they expect that democracy can deliver. And if democracy is not delivering it, we begin to see people thinking perhaps it's not for us. This question about appropriateness of democracy was not asked in the first wave. We've asked it starting in the second wave with the Arab Spring, essentially. And there hasn't really been significant change between the second and third, but we started to see it in the fourth. This is where really things started to go bad for the entire region. This is between 13 and 16. And in the fifth wave, things seem to have settled down a little bit, so we're seeing a decline. Settling down in this sense, that is, the perception of insecurity have gone down somewhat in the fifth wave compared to the fourth wave. Social issues. We've focused on gender issues. I said earlier, don't expect dramatic changes. You'll see it here with regard to there were a lot of things I did not include that dealt with equal rights. So the region will say, yeah, of course, equal rights for women. But in this case, we're not asking about equal rights. We're asking about the role, whether the women can play the same role as men. This is about being a president, and the majority is in fact in favor, of course. Why not? Not in Algeria, Sudan, 50-50. Everybody else has a majority. Before the Arab Spring, 57% thought that. Now 60%. That's an improvement, but just a bit. These are three issues. Oh, actually, this is one issue. This is about we've asked whether men are better political leaders. A majority of almost 2/3 say yes. Men are better political leaders. We can see this clearly in Sudan, Egypt, Algeria, Jordan, less so in Tunisia, Lebanon, and Morocco. Clearly, there are differences here. We also asked women whether they agree with that. Now, the graph in the middle shows that actually a majority of women too agree with that. So we thought it's education. So the graph to the right looks at controlling education, and the picture, well, changes a little bit, just a little bit. More for women, in fact, than for men, but clearly, with the exception of Morocco, Lebanon, and Tunisia, these are the three exceptions to the rule. Overall, on this issue, the region isn't moving forward. These are people who agree that men make better political leaders. Slight improvement, but not much. Once again, the Arab Spring hasn't really created miracles, if anyone was expecting miracles from the Arab Spring. Okay. Husbands should have final say. That's again a social issue, and clearly here too, we see the entire region in favor of that. As we saw earlier, Morocco seemed to be the outlier. The trend is really not changing, and this is a recent question that we've asked. But overall, you can see the region remains conservative and traditional when it comes to social issues and gender. University education for boys more important than for girls? No, the region says no. So this is one piece of good news, although the change here is also not so dramatic. But overall, it means that education is valued by the entire region. In some countries more than others. But, you should see Morocco, Lebanon, Palestine, Libya. This is where, a very small minority would agree that education is more important for boys than for girls. So essentially 1/5 of the region seem to have remained more traditional conservative when it comes to education and gender questions. And the trend overall is positive. But between the fourth and the fifth wave, it started to reverse. Hopefully it's not going to continue that way, but clearly in some countries it is. Look, in Egypt in particular, we can see a significant This is a question we only asked in this survey. This is the first time we've asked husbands whether their wives wear hijab. Hijab, or niqab, by the way, in some countries like Yemen, for example, we also said hijab or niqab. Where niqab is known, we've asked about it as well. So this is a combination. And as you can see, with the exception of Tunisia, even there, we have a majority who report that they do. This should not necessarily mean religiosity. In a minute, we will see why. Okay. Here again, we come back to the question of income and its impact on social matters. Rich people, this is where the picture with regard to income, high income individuals tend to be more liberal than low income individuals. We can see this with regard to thinking that men are better leaders, with those who agree that husbands have final say. Religiosity, well, my colleague Walid is here. He and I have been working on this question of religiosity and income. We haven't included this slide here. There is no doubt that, and the reason we haven't included it is because we're still grappling with this issue. We're trying to understand why. Half of the region shows significant correlation, positive correlation, between low income and religiosity. In some countries, however, it's the opposite. So the region is essentially divided between countries that show this high positive correlation between poverty and religiosity, and the other half showing the opposite. And as I said, we haven't really finished understanding it, so it is really not included here. But you can see here some of the countries where we do have some evidence showing that. But if you look at MENA overall, you can see that in fact it doesn't really show that kind of variation that I'm talking about. And the reason why MENA isn't showing that is exactly that the region is divided, with half going one direction and the other half is going in the opposite direction. Okay, religion. You will remind me when this is 45, right? We're not there yet, right? Okay, we clearly see that slightly more than a third of the people in the region are religious. So some of you who might not see our findings before might be surprised. A lot of people think people in the region must be religious. Religion is so important to them. Actually, religion is important, but they're not necessarily religious. You can see age, dramatic differences age-wise. 40% of the 30 and above are religious compared to only 27% for the younger, for the 18 to 29. In some countries, I remind you of what I said earlier about Egypt and Morocco. Look for Egypt and Morocco in all the slides. Those of you who can look back at the slides, you'll see that Egypt and Morocco, in particular, the gap between young and old, and in case of Egypt, of course, rich and poor, is very great in the last survey. There is a group that who would define themselves as not religious. So the group that you see to the left are those who define themselves as religious. And you can see the age difference is very clear here. The group to the right is a group that defines itself as not religious. And clearly here again, age is very important. The youth tend to be more willing to say so. And Tunisia is an example of the gap, a huge gap, followed by Libya and Algeria. But in Tunisia, 46% of the population, of the youth of the country, say they are not religious. They have a choice of saying, we're a little religious, but they've decided not to take it. The trend for both, for those who say they are religious, before the Arab Spring it was 35, today it is 35. There really hasn't been much of a change with regard to religiosity. However, look to the right, from 8 to 13, not a lot, but still a trend that is continuing. This, by the way, is on the eve of the Arab Spring. The early signs of the Arab Spring is the trend that I'm showing for the not religious. The question was asked slightly differently in the first wave, and this is why we decided not to include it. We now are trying to understand political Islam. Again, this is a much trickier business than the earlier business. The earlier business is really about people defining themselves. But here, we were not asking people to say whether they are Islamists or not. This is a concept that for most people is meaningless. Even for some academics, it's meaningless. Nonetheless, it's a useful tool that we are using here. And so this is one of the questions that we asked to track political Islam. And so this is about the perception that of the religious people. So this is applied when we're talking about Islam. Is obviously we're talking about people who are religious, not people who are not religious. So we are trying to understand whether they think Islam is state and religion, or whether Islam is just a religion for private practice. So people have the ability here to say it's private or public. And as you can see here, the religious people are divided right in the middle for the region, 48 to 48, who say private or public. In some countries, however, look at Morocco, and then go all the way up to Jordan. That's one class of countries. And then go up to Libya and all the way up to Lebanon, and that's a different class of countries. The region is divided between countries that have the potential of political Islam that is greater than the other set of countries that we see in front of us. And this is the trend. It has been a slight decline. I say that if you look at where we were before the Arab Spring in wave 1, it is 41%. I must add to that the question about religiosity in that question was somewhat different. So these findings for the first wave are not 100%. I just put it there as a point of reference. But now look at wave 2. It was 35 to 38, 50, and 48. So there is a slight decline in the last survey, but we were at 50% in 2016. This is another way in which we try to explore political Islam, by asking people whether they believe that religious leaders should influence government decisions. The age-wise, with the exception of, again, Morocco, in this case Egypt as well, the age is not all that important for all the other countries. The trend is that there has been a decline since the Arab Spring. But again, the trend in this question, however, is reversing. So in the earlier slide, if you go back, you can see that there has been a decline. Religious people who view religion as a public matter, a slight decline from 50 to 48. In this case, there is an increase from 28 to 33%, which is the opposite of what I said earlier. This is why it's the concept itself and the means available to us to measure it are not fully adequate yet to help us assess Islamism in the region. Immigration. Here, age, of course, is extremely critical. I don't have a lot of time, and I do have to go over the rest of the slides very quickly. So I'm going to quickly say what it shows without having to spend a lot of time on it. Dramatic differences. Half of the youth in the region want to leave their countries. Look at Morocco. 70% of the youth want to leave the country. Sudan, 62%. Jordan, 60%. For Jordan, by the way, this is a dramatic increase for Jordan. This is almost a doubling of the percentage of the Jordanians who say, overall, who say that they want to leave the country. There has been a slight decrease, by the way, in the fourth wave in 2016, and it's picking up once again. What drives the demand for immigration? Economics. That is what is the most important driver. This is true for the youth, and it is true for the older generation. There is no doubt that education is a second issue. That is seeking education. That is people, the youth, wanting to immigrate because of search for education, or running away from corruption. These are basically the three most important factors. The brain drain. The brain drain can be seen here. 12 years of education compared to 1 to 12 years of education, more than 12 to less than 12. 27% to 43%, that's a major difference. And if you look at some of the countries, look at Morocco, it's double that. Look at Yemen, 18 to 42, huge differences based on education. People who are educated leave. Where? Europe is number one. This is particularly true for North Africa. If you look at Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, add to that Palestine and Lebanon, and Europe is the first choice. The Gulf, for some. You look at Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, and Jordan. The Gulf is important. North America, Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, Libya, and Tunisia. Turkey, in case of Iraq, by the way, Jordan and Yemen, we find demand to immigrate to Turkey. International politics. What is hurting the region? Is this regional tension a reflection of a religious war between the Sunnites and the Shiites? The region says no, it is not. Only a fifth of the people of the region agree with that. The rest basically say this is a political conflict. It's not a religious conflict. In some cases, in Yemen, the percentage is much higher, but in cases of Palestine, Libya, Algeria, Iraq, people say it is not a religious conflict. Who is the enemy? Israel or Iran? Israel is, for 37%. Iran is actually a fourth. Before Iran, we have the US, and we have no country. Some of the countries say nobody is a threat. Like in Algeria, 47% say nobody. Morocco, 1/3 say nobody. Iran, however, is a threat to Yemen, to Iraq, and to some extent Jordan. Saudi Arabia to some, in Yemen, in Iraq, and in Palestine, some. Turkey, in Libya, Egypt, Iraq. 1 in 6 agree that it's okay to coordinate foreign policy with Israel, by the way. This is the first time we've asked this question. And look at Sudan, Palestine, and Egypt, where the percentage is actually higher than the rest. Whose foreign policy is good for the region? Erdogan's. Erdogan comes out on top, followed by Putin, Trump at the bottom. China, in a war with the US, China wins. Countries like Jordan, Libya, Tunisia, Sudan, Iraq. The US is high in Sudan, in Jordan, in Tunisia. Turkey or Iran, who wins? Turkey. All the way, in all the countries. These are people who say we want to have relations with Turkey, not Iran. And that is in the entire region. even in countries where there isn't a lot of love for either country, like in Egypt, there is still a distinction between Iran and Turkey in favor of Turkey. Internet, this is the last topic. Internet, absolutely, age-wise, is critical. 81 to 48% for the region. Some countries, in some places more than others. Look at Egypt, 31% to 82%. In Lebanon and Jordan, for the youth, 95% use the internet. This is a daily use of the internet. What media you rely on? Here we see a difference as well. Social media, for the 18 to 29 by 53%. These are people who go to the media for breaking news. For those over 30 and over, clearly much less, still a majority, for the social media, it is only a quarter. These people go to TV instead of social media. Why? Some of you might think it's because they're not technologically aware. That actually doesn't seem to be the answer. It seems to be a question of trust. Trust. Here you can see to the left all respondents, and we can see age-wise that it is critical. These are people who say they trust social media. So if you are older, you do not trust social media. If you are young, you trust social media. Okay, now turn to the right. These are people who actually use social media. Do you see a difference? No. They all trust social media. Age becomes almost irrelevant. Important, but almost irrelevant. The difference between 62 and 69%. So those who do not trust social media do not use social media. And those are 30 and above. Thank you very much.